Good evening, dear audience of Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada. On behalf of the Institute, I welcome all of you to episode number 19 of our project IDEA webinar. IDEA stands for Identify, Demystify, and Empower Russian and Ukrainian diaspora to fight against disinformation. Our today's webinar's title is Russia's Disinformation in Foreign Policy. And our today's guest is Michel Cormier, who is the former executive director of News and Current Radio Canada, the French network of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Welcome, Michel.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Dear audience, before I begin, let me do the treaty recognition. Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada is located on original lands of Anishinaabe Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homelands of Métis Nation. We believe in the reconciliation, and we promise to work together in the spirit of collaboration. Dear audience, Project IDEA is funded by Department of Heritage within this Digital Citizenship Contribution Program. It supports Government of Canada's three objectives. It helps to develop tools and skills necessary to better equip us in the face of disinformation and other related online harms. It builds capacity to address disinformation and other related harms and threats to our country's democracy and social cohesion. And it empowers Canadians to take steps to mitigate against the potential impact of disinformation. Project IDEA has three parts. First, it aims to prepare an artificial intelligence-driven tools to detect mis and disinformation. And it also creates an platform where experts are invited, like Michel today, to share their ideas and insights about fighting disinformation. And finally, the last part of this project is to empower Ukrainian and Russian diaspora through education and through arranging a number of workshops. The audience, we are also very happy to note that our advisor, Mr. Gary Senft, is present with us this evening. And unfortunately, he would leave and he won't be able to be present with us throughout the session. But whatever amount of time he can spend with us, we are absolutely thrilled and delighted. The audience, before I introduce and read bio of Michel Cormier, let me set the scene of our today's discussion. As you have already come to know that we are talking about disinformation in this age and how to combat it. But our particular focus is on Ukraine war and the disinformation and misinformation coming from Russia. Just recently, to be exact, yesterday, we have come to know from various publications and posts that Russia is claiming that Ukraine is going to detonate a dirty bomb. And I'm quoting here from an article published just yesterday in Washington Post. And the title is, "What's a Dirty Bomb and Why is there concern in Ukraine?" So the Ukrainian officials are claiming that this is Russia's disinformation campaign because there is nothing with regards to such kind of bomb available in Ukraine. A dirty bomb is basically a shorthand version of something nuclear experts call a radiological dispersal device, which is not exactly a bomb itself to the level of atomic bombs that we have seen in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but as a small scale which is intended to create panic and mass dispersion. And interestingly, when I was researching about dirty bomb and Russia's allegation, I came to know that in United Nations Security Council, Russia just today, actually in the afternoon, it has requested 2 meetings on Ukraine under the agenda item Threats to International Peace and Security. In these 2 meetings, which are kind of technical in the United Nations Security Council, Russia is requesting international bodies to investigate under the Biological Weapon Convention, Article 11, I think, yes, to investigate whether this is what Russia is expecting going to happen, orchestrated by Ukraine. So this is what I would like to share with the audience and our expert today, that during the war, what happens is information gets in so many directions, then we are really confused what is the truth actually we have at hand. And this is the latest episode of disinformation coming out from Russian channels and organizations, and social media is also full of information about the possibility of such a thing that might happen in Ukraine. And the last update is Ukraine has already allowed inspectors to inspect the number of sites so that there is no confusion about it. And finally, I would also like to add here that Russia has been claiming since March this year, after the war started, that Americans and Western allies have funded a number of biological chemical labs inside Ukraine. And the Russian general also claimed boldly in the media that they have evidences which we could not yet found any credibility. So with this brief context, let me open up our discussion today. And as I promised, I would love to read Michel's bio, because he comes with so much of experience and expertise. So Michel, he has 30 years of experience in public broadcasting. He was parliamentary correspondent in Ottawa, bureau chief in Quebec City, and was posted as a foreign correspondent to Moscow, Paris, and Beijing. That makes even our discussions more interesting today. From 2018 to 21, Michel taught journalism ethics at the Université de Montréal. He sits on the board of the Canadian Journalism Foundation, as well as on the board of directors of Reporters Without Borders, and on the steering committee of its Journalism Trust Initiative. And we have come to know Michel from our connections at Reporters Without Borders. Michel holds a bachelor degree in journalism from Carleton University and a master's in political science from Laval University. He is the author of 5 books. La Russie d'Illusions, which was published in 2006, was shortlisted for the Governor General's Award. So what a wonderful experience and track record of our today's guest. So without further ado, let me welcome Michel to the show. Sir, floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction. I'll be speaking more in my capacity as a foreign correspondent who saw the first overtaking of the media landscape by the Kremlin under Vladimir Putin in the early 2000s. I was in Moscow then when we saw all the different TV networks being confiscated from their owners and put at the service of the state. And this is kind of the machinery now that is used internally, at least for Russia, for the Kremlin's line on this war in Ukraine, and various propaganda or disinformation campaigns. Plus, of course, their international network now, RT, that actually does also provide a lot of information from the Kremlin's point of view. I also work with the Reporters Without Borders, and for those who know this organization, it was since the start mainly an organization that was trying to defend journalists and try to get them out of difficult situations, often jail or arrests, or try to defend them. Now there is a second kind of tier to what the Reporters Without Borders does, is to actually try to fight disinformation and promote responsible journalism. So this is also part of what we do now. It is so important. So this is the background I bring to this talk tonight, and I'll just talk about how this war, what happened to the environment both in Ukraine and in Russia, and how it was against our expectations in the first when the war started, and what are maybe the lessons to take in terms of information flow when the war is over, and how it's become a kind of a test case for journalists with all the new technology. So, when the war started back in February, we all had this apprehended scenario that the war would be over soon, perhaps in a few days, that Ukraine would fall quickly and becomes, in terms of a free press, basically an extension of Russia, that it would be under either military occupation or possibly martial law, that the press would be censored, and that truth would become, as the cliche says, the first casualty of war. That journalists, in this context, both Ukrainians and foreigners, would have to work clandestinely underground in dangerous conditions to tell the story of life under Russian rule. Well, as we all know, that scenario didn't happen because something else did happen. The Ukrainians not only stopped the Russians in Kiev's suburbs, but turned them back. And this created a whole different environment for the press, both domestic and for the foreign journalists who were there, and actually changed our expectations and reading of the war and the whole information flow. So, instead, like I said, Ukraine has become kind of a unique case study in war journalism, operating with unprecedented means thanks to technology, social media, drones now that can actually gather information and have it in real time, reliable internet connections that allow you to actually report or have information given to you from all points in the war, including occupied territories. And this has enabled journalists to tell the story of the war not only in free Ukrainian territory, as I said, but also from inside occupied territory. And it also had the consequence of making disinformation less effective. And I'll get to that a bit more later. So the other thing also, and I'll want to work to talk about that a little bit, is that journalists have also been able to tell what's going on in Russia, and have been able to do this, because of the internet and because of social media, even though a lot of them were not in Russia or under, quite severe censorship. And this, enabled the press outside of Russia to actually outmaneuver the Kremlin's propaganda machine in many ways. So this is, it's not usual for me to have a kind of an optimistic view of disinformation and propaganda. And of course, we all know that, during war, propaganda is really one of the main weapons that countries actually use to try to gain favor or advantage in the conflicts. But I think we have seen something very different that will change the face of journalism in war situations for a long time. But let's go back to the start of the war, because, like I said, it was not a foregone conclusion that journalists would actually be able to actually report on this war. A lot of the Ukrainian journalists had to pack up and leave with their families, go to Lviv or even to Poland or to other, neighboring countries. And the foreign correspondents, of course, were deciding when to leave because the Russians were coming. So, but after the first few weeks, when we realized that this war was kind of a stalemate and that no side was winning, and it was impossible to actually go back into Ukraine and cover the war. Well, things had to happen, because you need journalists actually to be equipped to actually do this. So something quite unique happened at that time, because the international community came together to help Ukrainian journalists with all kinds of resources, because as many of you know from the Ukrainian community, journalism in Ukraine is not a long-standing experience. And you have a lot of journalists who actually worked on small internet, small digital news sites, and are not very equipped. The other thing is that, a lot of them had no war experience. And of course, covering wars is actually very, very specialized activity. So what happened is that, the international community, led by organizations like Reporters Without Borders, gathered some funds and some trainers and set up training centers inside Ukraine for Ukrainian journalists and also other journalists from outside who wanted to cover the war, giving them, safety instruction, safety equipment, medical training, and even financial help for the families so they could actually, afford to cover the war. So this program has helped more than 600 journalists, many of them Ukrainian, since the start of the war, and made sure that there were a lot of reporters on the ground to report on what was happening. And this is the most essential way of fighting disinformation, is actually have eyes on the ground. And this was a very, very, I think, important development right at the start of the war. As a result, the journalists have been able, along with reporters from other countries, to tell the story of the war, to document the destruction and the evidence of war crimes when that was possible, and contradict the Russian propaganda of a successful special military operation. And this is quite astounding, because given the means of those journalists and the Russian government's media machine is quite unequal in terms of means. But at the same time, when you are able to actually cut through the propaganda and get real information and broadcast it, it goes a long way to actually counteracting false information. The other thing is that this was the first real social media war. And like I said, the advantage that many Ukrainian journalists had is that they work already for digital news sites. So they're familiar with the internet and they can work from everywhere. All they need is a cell phone and a good connection. And, incredibly, that kind of was maintained over the Ukrainian territory for most of the war. That was quite incredible, because we all thought that the internet would be crashed and that it would be hard to communicate. But these journalists were able to actually to do interviews on their cell phones with people on the front line, soldiers, or even with people who were behind the enemy lines, or who were being holed up in their apartments under bombings, or who were living under occupation of Russian troops. And this was the first way that this information was diffused, because we did not only have the Russian version of what was happening in the territory that they controlled. You had actually eyewitnesses who could actually communicate with the outside world, and that is that was a fundamental difference, because in no other war yet have you seen so many people have so many technical means to actually broadcast information from all points of the conflict. In Russia, of course, it was a different story, because for the Kremlin, as the campaign kind of started to sputter, it went from a propaganda offensive to convince the world that it was liberating Ukrainians from a fascist government, to a defensive campaign to keep the Russian population on side. And that was quite a pivot, I'm sure, for the communications experts in Moscow. Not that they were not doing both at the same time, but I think there was a shift in the focus of what was important to keep the Russians, from getting information that contradicted the Kremlin line, for one, and keeping them on side of the war. But in the process, and this will be studied, I'm sure, for a long time, it has damaged even further the Russian media environment, because in its effort to control the information, as we've seen, the Russian government muzzled even more the press by making it illegal to criticize the war, or even making it illegal to call, not to call the war a special military operation. Some media organizations that are critical of the war in Russia were closed down, some very famous newspapers, for example. And Russia either expelled some foreign correspondents, or even, pressured them to close down their bureaus even temporarily. I mean, the Radio-Canada and CBC bureau has been closed now for the first time since the 1960s. We were there for over 50 years, and now the bureau is closed. We hope that eventually it'll be reopened, but it has been a casualty of the war. So most Russians, of course, in these conditions have, the Kremlin's version of the war. And truth has become a casualty of the conflict, but mainly in Russia more than in Ukraine. Some things are changing now. We see it in terms of the information flow in Russia because of the mobilization of 200,000 Russian men, and also that information filtering that the war is not going to plan is starting to change these things, the perception of the war. And again, social media is a major factor in this, because bereaved families who are, whose sons or husbands or brothers or uncles have died in Ukraine and come back to be buried in their villages now, actually do communicate over social media, and this gets out in the world, and you can see this on the internet all the time. So it's impossible to control this information for the regime. Soldiers at the front complaining about having no equipment or food or no leadership. Russian journalists who fled Russia also now who broadcast from outside Russia. And, it doesn't take much to actually set up shop and actually do some broadcasts. So this is a very different and a very new development that helps everybody fight disinformation or get out different versions of what's happening on the ground. So like I said, it is a different war in terms of information. I think it has changed, the perceived effectiveness of a major propaganda machine, because it doesn't take much, only a good internet connection and the ability to actually reach people who have a different version of what events are. And it has changed the perception and the information flow of the war. It made, I think, disinformation a lot less significant and effective. So we'll be studying this for a long time, but it's been a watershed, I think, for the analysis of disinformation and propaganda. So with that, just a few remarks. I'm happy to take questions or comments or keep the discussion going. So thanks.
Thank you so much. I would like to invite Gary to kindly have the first question, because he would leave soon. So Gary, please go ahead.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by thanking Michel for a long and distinguished career in one of the most important pillars of democracy, keeping journalism moving. So thank you, just so much for sharing what you're doing and for staying in the game and continuing, to be very active in some very complex situations. So thank you for that. As an observer only, one watched, the news at the beginning of the war was almost a complete cycle about the war. And as we move on into maybe our 8th month or so now, one of the concerns is, will we have the attention span to keep on this and be effective? And it may be important for reporters to be even more precise and concise in how they're able to communicate the information. How do we stay in the game, Michel, because it's so complicated?
Well, if like I said, when there's developments, then there is more news. So I think what journalists have been doing, when there is less, combat news, to use that word, is actually do stories about families, about underlying issues, about different aspects of the war that I think make it more human and personal to viewers, because otherwise it becomes very kind of clinical, and when it's just about warfare and territory lost and gained, it becomes kind of depersonalized. So I think this is what happens. I've kind of been surprised that how high it is still in the news cycle, because we do have a short attention span even for conflicts. The Syrian one was a case in point. But I think the fact that now we can actually, as soon as there is some declaration from a side or the other, and it can be challenged or verified quickly, I think that adds to the interest into the journalism that's done. Hopefully.
Thank you.
It's a good point.
And with the work that you're doing with the Reporters Without Boundaries, you mentioned a program that I wasn't aware of, assisting Ukrainian journalists to do their work and do it well. Is that something that the public can help with and donate to through their website or something?
Yes, I think so. And it's not just Reporters Without Borders. It's an association of a few humanitarian agencies who have the whole infrastructure for that. If people go on the Reporters Without Borders website, it's rsf.com. You can get all the information in French or English. That's all there. But, the 2 weeks after the war, this center was opened in Lviv to actually help train and give it medical equipment and protection equipment like helmets and bulletproof vests and even insurance policies. Life insurance for Ukrainian journalists, and also for journalists from outside who are not part of big organizations and who don't have the means to do this. Because the idea is also to increase the diversity of voices who actually report on the war. Because the more you have a diversity of reporters, the better informed the public will be, hopefully.
One of the interesting things with social media today and just the ability to get so much information is, we see that what are crimes against humanity, perhaps war crimes and the crime of aggression, all these different terminologies for legal battles. In the past, it's been very difficult to get the evidence necessary to support these cases, and it's taken many, many years. In this case, with all the reporting and reporters and the quality of the work being done, there may be some real benefit that's actually different in the reporting cycle than what might have been seen in the past. Do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, totally. Because usually when you're in a war zone, you try to, after the battle is done or the fighting is over, you go and you try to find witnesses to corroborate events or actions. Now, for most of these events, there's somebody with a cell phone who actually records it live. So you do have the physical evidence that is already there, that that is not corroborated by people speaking about it. And so that's a very different. It makes collecting evidence, I think, easier, because you have film of actually the bomb falling or the people being hurt. So it's not just hearsay or from witnesses that you interview afterwards. So I think it's a very good point, and it of course you have to verify the accuracy of this film, because it is possible to actually use this information for disinformation purposes. But most cell phones have data, have real-time recording, proof. So it makes it all different, but it changes the whole experience and the whole environment. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and Kauser, I apologize to Michelle and everyone to have to jump out, but I will be listening to the recorded version of it very intently. And thank you so much. It's a pleasure meeting you. And Kauser, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you. So we are back again into the discussion, and at this point in time, we are going to engage with Michelle in a conversational mode. So Michelle, my first question to you, and if you allow me to go back to the past, you have spent time in Moscow reporting, working there previously. And so the question is, what do you see in terms of the qualitative change amongst the Russian citizens, normal people, back in the days and in the current era? Do you think that, because you have mentioned in your opening remarks that in current Russian society, it is nearly impossible to speak against the regime or against the war itself. So do you see, or do you think there is a sea change within the Russian population about the concept of the West and enemies and so on and so forth?
I don't think so. I mean, I think after the fall of the the regime of the USSR, and the first, experiments at democracy and the free market. Most Russians were disillusioned with this, so this disillusionment has been there for a long time. But there's, among ordinary Russians, there was not a lot of animosity towards, the West. It was also always a kind of a mainstay of the political line of the Kremlin, especially with the arrival of Vladimir Putin. From the start, of course, he said that the worst tragedy of the century was the fall of the USSR. So it kind of, was quite obvious what kind of agenda he would pursue. But right now, I think Russians are much more ignorant of events beyond Russia, and also inside Russia. They got one version, but I don't think it has changed fundamentally how they see the West. There was a great patriotic, rallying around getting Crimea, in 2014, but this doesn't seem to be the case now because, people don't see the same value in Ukraine, I believe. So.
Thank you. The next question to you would be, Michel. We are trying to understand the depth of the disinformation that is going on inside Russia. Of course, a part of it is convincing its own people about the justification of Ukraine war by the Russian regime. But also we are interested to know how it impacts the diaspora people that who live with us in Canada. So what is your take on this and the impact of so much of consuming information directly coming out of Russia, and what is the fallout of this issue?
Well, I really don't want to speak, for the Russian diaspora. They have a better sense of what this means. But what we've heard, of course, is these families who are split between Russia and our countries, who had total different impression of this war, and being on total opposite sides of information, and that's kind of really sad in a sense. But it just shows the chasm in what information people are offered in Russia about what's happening in Russia and the rest of the planet at this time. But the big disinformation story of this war is about the Kremlin line inside Russia, and how they've actually managed to a point to keep this under control. Although now we see signs of this fracturing, because as I say, as Russian conscripts come back, injured or even having been killed in Ukraine, it changes the whole perspective in a whole village. And you have a lot of villages like this, and then that changes the narrative, I think, inside Russia, or brings a different point of view. But it by no means, I think, threatens the regime or the overwhelming narrative that is out there in Russia, for sure.
Absolutely. Michel, I would be very curious to know your insights about the problem of mainstream media versus social media. You are very right in saying perhaps that it is the age of social media, and particularly this war is very unique, which maybe journalists and others would study for years in the future in the case of reporting. So in general, we have seen after 2016 election in the US and moving forward till to date, there is a general problem in consuming news from mainstream channels. Rather, more people are leaning towards consuming information and news from social media channels. And in our project, we have interacted with Ukrainians coming into Canada, and they told us that they don't watch any mainstream channels. Rather, they subscribe to the news of the group they formed in WhatsApp, in Telegram channels, and these are what their main source of information on war. So, given this scenario, Michel, what do you see in the future in terms of reporting authentic, legitimate news of conflict?
Well, it's a very pertinent question. The important thing is to actually make sure that credible news is available and accessible to the people, so they don't get just caught in their social media silos and actually only have one version, a distorted version of what's happening, and you get comforted by the same impressions and the same opinions. So, for example, at Reporters Sans Frontières, we believe that it's impossible to fight disinformation just with fact checking, because you only convince the people who agree with fact checking, not the people who get taken with the false information. So the best way to do this is actually to promote credible news and have standards that people adhere to. We have what we call the Journalism Trust Initiative, which is an international standard that is actually, media organizations apply for this, and there's a jury to make sure that they have editorial standards and transparency, and that they conform with what's considered a credible and responsible media organization. And we're trying to convince, for example, the platforms to make sure that the content of these recognized news organizations is more visible in feeds on YouTube or on Facebook or on other social platforms, so that this credible information is easier to find for people and gets them out of their silos. But it's a long game. It's a difficult fight, and we are not sure of the result. But that's what we came up with a strategy. So, but it is a real problem when people are just getting informed on Facebook or among their friends, or in news sites that are very marginal and not really reliable. But maybe as much as I do for solutions. We're all trying to find a way.
No, absolutely. This is such a relevant discussion because on the one hand, the mainstream media, we have a structure, as you rightly mentioned. There's an ethical standard of gathering information and seeking truth. But on the other side, in the social media, the apps and websites of small group of people can open up any websites in minutes, and they can decide whatever information they want to share. But the problem of our age here is to differentiate between truth and falsehood. And here comes the question of fake news, disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation spreading like in a very large extent, and it goes back to the minds of people, because again the question of span of attention is so less in today's context. People do not want to even do fact checking. In our first workshop, we have really discussed about this matter of media literacy, digital skill, and requesting participants that please do fact check. But one of the feedbacks is that we don't have time. We just read the news quickly, and then we decide whether to share it. And this whole business of sharing news becomes it takes this whole issue to a different level. Your take on this?
Yeah, it does. But at the same time, I think that standards are becoming more important now, because otherwise they were taken for granted. And there was some lax behavior in newsroom also before, because you had less people checking the work that we did. Now I think there is a recognition that we have to get back to these basics of ethical journalism. Of course, people will make mistakes, but do you correct them? So if you have a news organization that not only corrects its mistakes but actually puts it prominently on their websites, here we have made a mistake and here we have corrected it, that increases the credibility of the news media. And I'm kind of optimistic in the sense that it's there's a lot of thought being put into and care being put into making sure that these standards are promoted again. And I think it's the only defense we have, right? So, but there's a clear distinction now between professional journalism and journalism that is not. So I think that hopefully we can move forward.
Thank you. So I'm just at the end of this session this evening. One of my last questions would be to you, Michel. What do you see the consequences of disinformation with regards to Ukrainians, those who are arriving in our country seeking refuge from the conflict? The reason I'm raising this question, because in our workshop, we have been told that because of this depth of disinformation campaign, the relationship of various social groups like ethnic Russian here and ethnic Ukrainians have soured to a very great extent. And this actually leads to this idea of social cohesion that we are so proud of in our country, about multiculturalism. So do you see that is happening, and how do you really overcome such a problem in the future?
Well, I'm not really in a position to comment on how deep or how prevalent this is, but at the same time, I think if we can actually agree on a basis of facts and have discussions and dialogue around verified facts and a reality that has been fact checked, I think that goes a long way to actually mending differences or misperceptions. But there's no miracle solutions when peoples are at war either. It does have consequences, and that's too bad.
Thank you. My last question is to you, Michel, this evening is, what are your hopes and fears for the future of journalism, as you initially commented in your opening remarks, and also about the war itself? Do you see hopes, or you are fearful about the future?
Well, I'm kind of a natural optimist, but it is pretty hard these days on a number of fronts. But I think there is a future for journalism, because I think people have recognized now that this information is such a threat to everything, because all the problems we're trying to solve, for example, climate change. If there is no credible basis of fact to actually work from, then it's game over. So I think journalism has never been as important as it is now. And I think we are giving ourselves the tools to actually combat and diffuse disinformation. It may take a while, but I think we're getting there, and hopefully that also applies to wars and conflicts. I think the more information you have, before, when I was covering the war in Afghanistan, we had no idea what was happening beyond the army we were with in the north, and had no pictures, had no information, or very little. We couldn't verify anything. Now I think this war has changed all that, and hopefully if it's good for war, it should be good for the situation also, that we have the means to get information and we should use them.
Thank you so much, Michel, for your wonderful comment. And the audience, we are going to end our session this evening with some sobering thoughts. You have listened to Michel's wonderful explanations of disinformation, the nature of changing journalism, and how qualitatively it is going to have impact in the future with regards to the mode of delivery of information. We have also discussed about the impacts of disinformation onto people itself, because this is the focus of our project today, that how people are impacted. Michelle suggested that fact-checking is very important, and we should be more relying on gathering facts before we come to a judgment and a decision about an event and incident. Michel is very hopeful, as he rightly mentioned, that he is naturally optimistic person. So we also would like to echo with Michel that we are hopeful that we have a lot of means to nowadays verify information, even in the war zone. That what Michel compared his time in Afghanistan versus Ukraine. That in Ukraine war, we have seen that we have lots of ways to verify certain information coming into our hands because of the technology. And this is what he sees as a hope for the future, because we are able to verify information. So with these thoughts, ladies and gentlemen, dear audience, I will leave you with the idea that Ukraine war is in its eighth month now. And as I started today's session by saying that the current narrative is about nuclear possibility of certain extent of nuclear issues, and we all are worried about the ongoing development, and hopefully we all will see the end of the war peacefully, so that everybody lives peacefully in this world without any hostility and conflict. Thank you very much once again being with us. Please tune in a Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Project Idea website, and we are also available and you can find us in YouTube and Facebook channels. And we are going to have our second workshop on November 18th on disinformation and how to combat it. Thank you very much, and stay well, stay fine. Bye-bye.